March 8, 1945, 2:17 p.m. Iwo Jima, Pacific Ocean. The engine of the Type 97 Jiha tank coughed once, twice, then died with a metallic wheeze that seemed to echo across the volcanic wasteland. Colonel Takeichi Nishi slammed his fist against the turret hatch, the clang reverberating through his bones, through his soul, through everything he had believed about this war. Inside the driver's compartment, Private Hiroshi Yamamoto frantically turned the ignition key, pumping the accelerator, his hands shaking not from fear of American bullets, but from something far worse, the terror of complete helplessness. The 170-horsepower diesel engine remained silent, dead. The fuel gauge needle rested firmly on empty and had been there for the past 6 hours. Colonel-san, Yamamoto's voice cracked, saturated with a panic that went beyond mere combat stress. The reserve tank, it's also dry. We have nothing left. Nishi climbed down from his command vehicle, his boots sinking into the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, that godforsaken island the Empire had sworn to defend to the last man, to the last bullet, to the last breath. Around him stretched a scene that would have been almost comical if it weren't so utterly devastating. 17 tanks of the 26th Tank Regiment of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 43 Isuzu military trucks, and approximately 800 soldiers of the Empire's finest, the elite warriors who had trained for years to face the American enemy in glorious combat. All of them completely, utterly, hopelessly immobilized. Not by American artillery fire, not by naval bombardment, not by aerial attack, not by the superior tactics of the United States Marine Corps, but by the simple, mundane, catastrophic absence of fuel. Through the acrid smoke still rising from the previous night's bombardment, through the sulphurous haze that perpetually hung over this volcanic hellscape, Nishi could see the American supply depot his forces had captured just 3 hours earlier during a desperate counterattack. The Marines had retreated so quickly, so casually, that they had left everything behind, fires still burning in oil drums, half-eaten K-rations scattered across the ground, Lucky Strike cigarettes still smoldering in improvised ashtrays, coffee still warm in metal canteen cups. And there, arranged in perfect military rows as if they were a gift from the gods of war themselves, stood hundreds upon hundreds of 55-gallon drums, painted in that distinctive olive-drab green that had become the color of American industrial might. Fuel drums. Thousands of them. Nishi approached slowly, almost reverently, as if walking through a temple rather than a captured enemy position. Lieutenant Yasunori Aoki, his second in command, had already pried open one of the drums and was inhaling deeply, his eyes wide with something between joy and disbelief. Colonel-san, high-octane gasoline. Aviation fuel, American fuel. Aoki's voice trembled with barely contained emotion, and already Nishi's men had begun the frenzied work of transferring this miraculous discovery into their own parched vehicles, tankers that had been silent and useless for days now roaring back to life, trucks that had been abandoned as immobile obstacles suddenly capable of movement once more. The promise of continued offensive operations suddenly, impossibly, within reach again. But while his soldiers worked and celebrated, while they shouted and laughed with the relief of men who had been granted an unexpected reprieve from certain death, Nishi walked among the stockpiles, counting, calculating, his trained military mind automatically tallying the numbers. The final count made him stop breathing for a moment. 15,000 gallons, approximately 56,780 liters of high-quality American fuel, sitting here in this single depot, abandoned without a second thought by an enemy who apparently had so much of everything that they could simply leave it behind like garbage. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, to truly comprehend what this moment meant, one must understand that these 15,000 gallons represented almost 4 months of fuel allocation for Nishi's entire tank regiment, more combustible than his unit had received in the previous 6 months of fighting combined, enough to power every vehicle under his command for weeks of continuous operations, enough to potentially change the tactical situation on Iwo Jima, enough to make the difference between defeat and survival. The Americans had simply abandoned it, left it sitting here like it meant nothing, like it was trash, not worth the effort of destroying. Nishi stood there among the drums, watching his men pour American gasoline into Japanese tanks, and a realization began to settle over him like the volcanic ash that perpetually fell from Iwo Jima's tortured sky. If the Americans could afford to simply abandon such quantities, if they could leave behind in a single minor depot what would be a strategic treasure for the entire Imperial Japanese military, then this war had already been decided, and Japan had lost before the first shot was ever fired. But Nishi was not just any officer. At 42 years old, he was one of the few members of Japanese aristocracy actively serving in combat. A baron who had studied in the United States, attended Harvard University, competed in the 1932 Los Angeles Olympics where he won the gold medal in equestrian show jumping, becoming a celebrity in America where he befriended Hollywood stars like Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, drinking cocktails in Beverly Hills mansions and experiencing firsthand the casual, almost incomprehensible wealth of American society. He had walked through American factories, driven on American highways, seen American abundance with his own eyes during a time when such things seemed impressive but not threatening, interesting but not devastating. He knew America in a way that most Japanese officers did not, understood the industrial capacity of the enemy in a way that his superiors in Tokyo could not or would not comprehend. And standing here on Iwo Jima, surrounded by fuel drums that represented months of Japanese allocation, but apparently meant nothing to the Americans, Nishi finally, truly understood what Japan was fighting against. This was not a war between armies. This was not a conflict between brave soldiers and cowardly enemies. This was not a test of will or spirit or fighting excellence. This was a mathematical equation, a calculation of industrial output, a cold comparison of production statistics, and Japan was on the wrong side of numbers so enormous that courage became irrelevant, that Bushido became meaningless, that the entire spiritual foundation of Japanese military doctrine collapsed into insignificance before the brutal reality of American industrial abundance. While Nishi's men continued their desperate refueling operation, he opened his field journal and began to write, his hand steady despite the tremor of understanding that ran through him. Today we captured 15,000 gallons of American fuel. The men celebrate as if we have won a great victory. They do not yet understand that this discovery is not evidence of our success, but proof of our inevitable defeat. If the enemy can abandon such quantities without concern, then we are not fighting an opponent. We are struggling against an ocean with a teacup. He paused, staring at the words he had just written, words that would be considered defeatist, treasonous even, if anyone in the high command were to read them. But Nishi had moved beyond fear of censure or shame. He had moved into the realm of terrible clarity, the kind of understanding that comes when delusion finally shatters against the rocks of undeniable reality. 6 months before this moment, before Nishi's discovery on the black sands of Iwo Jima, the Imperial Japanese Navy had received a logistics report that should have ended all offensive operations immediately. A document that detailed with devastating precision the fuel situation facing the Japanese military. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, captured at such cost in 1942 and held as the lifeblood of Japanese mechanized warfare, were producing far below capacity due to equipment damage, lack of maintenance expertise, and constant submarine interdiction of tanker routes. Japan's domestic synthetic fuel production, never robust to begin with, had been systematically destroyed by American bombing raids. The numbers told a story that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. In 1944, the United States produced 1,800,000,000 barrels of crude oil. Japan, including all captured territories, all synthetic production, all desperate conservation measures, managed to scrape together barely 2,600,000 barrels, less than 0.15% of American production. The empire of the rising sun was attempting to wage modern mechanized warfare while operating on a fuel budget that would have been considered inadequate for a single American armored division. While the United States was drowning its military in petroleum abundance, running engines for warmth, using gasoline to wash equipment, operating vehicles continuously without concern for fuel consumption, the Japanese military was measuring every liter, rationing every drop, making impossible calculations about which operations could be supported and which units would simply have to remain stationary. Japanese tankers traveled from the Dutch East Indies to the home islands, running a gauntlet of American submarines that sent more fuel to the bottom of the Pacific than ever reached Japanese refineries. Aircraft were grounded not from battle damage, but from empty fuel tanks. Pilot training had been cut from 300 flight hours to barely 60 hours because there was simply no fuel available for practice flights. The combined fleet, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, had effectively ceased major operations, not because of ship losses, but because there was no fuel to power the vessels that remained. Destroyers sat in harbors, battleships remained at anchor, and the few operational carriers had aircraft but no fuel to launch them. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 67% of the world's petroleum, an amount so staggering that American military planners worried more about storage capacity than supply shortages. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of Japanese-controlled territory combined. American refineries were operating at such high capacity that Standard Oil was experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply because they had excess crude to process, playing with surplus while Japan desperately counted every barrel. The Americans had constructed a fuel distribution system across the Pacific that operated on a scale beyond Japanese comprehension tanker convoys, so large they required their own naval escorts, floating fuel depots, underwater pipelines, aerial fuel delivery systems, a logistical network that moved millions of gallons weekly across thousands of miles of ocean. American forces in the Pacific were consuming approximately 800,000 gallons of fuel daily and receiving closer to 1 million gallons per day. They were actually accumulating reserves while fighting, building stockpiles while conducting offensive operations, treating fuel as an abundant resource rather than a precious commodity to be hoarded and rationed. The strategic calculations underlying the Iwo Jima operation demonstrated this fundamental disparity with brutal clarity. American planners had allocated 3 million gallons of fuel just for the initial assault phase, with another 5 million gallons in reserve tankers offshore, amounts that exceeded Japan's entire monthly fuel budget for all military operations across all theaters of war. When American Marines landed on Iwo Jima, they came backed by a logistical system that could deliver fuel faster than they could consume it, that could replace losses instantly, that operated without the constant terror of running dry that characterized every Japanese military operation. As Nishi walked among the captured fuel drums, Lieutenant Aoki approached carrying a stack of documents found in the depot's administrative office. Aoki could read English, having studied at a missionary school before the war, and his face was pale as he handed the papers to Nishi. "Colonel San, these are shipping manifests. This fuel." It was produced in California, shipped to Pearl Harbor, transferred to LST vessels, and delivered here to Iwo Jima. The journey was over 4,000 miles. The time from refinery to front line was 17 days. Nishi took the documents, read them once, twice, feeling his hands begin to shake. 17 days. The fuel now being pumped into his tanks had traveled 4,000 miles in 17 days, across an ocean, through a war zone, delivered as casually as mail delivery, as routine as clockwork, as unremarkable as sunrise. Japanese fuel shipments from the Dutch East Indies, a distance less than half as far, took months when they arrived at all, traveled in constant terror of submarine attack, arrived in quantities far below what was shipped because so many tankers were sent to the bottom. The Americans were operating a transcontinental supply system that moved fuel across the Pacific faster than Japan could move it from occupied territories just hundreds of miles away. This was beyond mere industrial superiority. This was a fundamental difference in the nature of the two nations' capabilities, a chasm so wide that no amount of fighting spirit could bridge it. Private Kenji Tanaka, searching through the depot's abandoned supplies, discovered a stack of American military newspapers dated March 5th, just 3 days old. The headline celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Saipan to forward bases in the Marianas, a system capable of delivering 200,000 gallons daily, more fuel than the entire Japanese military operation on Iwo Jima had received since the American invasion began weeks earlier. A single pipeline, servicing one small chain of islands, delivering more daily than Japan could allocate to a battle that would determine the defense of the home islands themselves. Nishi read the article, his English still fluent from his years in America, and had to sit down on one of the fuel drums, his legs suddenly unable to support him. 200,000 gallons daily through a pipeline. The Japanese military was celebrating the capture of 15,000 gallons as if it were a strategic victory, while the Americans were building infrastructure that made such amounts meaningless, that operated on a scale where 15,000 gallons was a rounding error, beneath notice, literally garbage not worth destroying. To comprehend the psychological impact of Nishi's discovery, one must understand Japan's fuel situation by early 1945, the desperate calculus that governed every military decision, the constant shortage that shaped every operation and limited every tactical choice. Since late 1944, American submarine warfare had reduced fuel shipments from the Dutch East Indies by 90%, sending tanker after tanker to the ocean floor, cutting the arteries that supplied Japan's war machine. The few tankers that survived the journey arrived with cargo already depleted by the need to fuel their own engines for the lengthy voyage, delivering far less than they had loaded. Synthetic fuel production, never substantial, had collapsed under bombing raids and the loss of chemical plants. Aviation gasoline had become so scarce that kamikaze pilots were given just enough fuel for one-way trips, not because of tactical doctrine, but because there was literally no fuel to spare for potential returns. Japanese aircraft that survived missions were sometimes unable to fly again simply because there was no fuel available, leaving them to sit on airfields as useless monuments to resource depletion. The Imperial Navy had become a static force, its remaining ships confined to harbors not by enemy action, but by empty fuel bunkers, great battleships and carriers reduced to floating barracks because there was no fuel to move them. Training had essentially ceased across all branches. New pilots learned in gliders. Tank crews practiced without fuel in their vehicles. Naval officers studied tactics without ever taking their ships to sea, because every drop of fuel had to be hoarded for actual combat operations. On the home front, Japanese civilians had not seen private automobile traffic since 1942. Gasoline had become more precious than gold. The Kempeitai investigated black market fuel theft with the same intensity they pursued enemy spies, and farmers had returned to using oxen and horses because there was no fuel for tractors. Industrial production suffered as factories shut down from lack of fuel to power generators. Transportation networks collapsed as trains sat idle on tracks, and the entire economic infrastructure of the nation slowly ground to a halt from petroleum starvation. Meanwhile, the United States was producing such vast quantities that American civilians continued driving personal automobiles throughout the war. Gasoline rationing was more about rubber conservation than fuel shortage. Factories ran 3 shifts daily, and the military had so much fuel that field commanders complained about the logistical burden of managing excessive stockpiles rather than worrying about shortages. This disparity was not merely quantitative, it represented a fundamental difference in the nature of the two societies, one that had bet everything on a short war before resources ran out, the other that possessed resources so vast that running out was simply impossible to imagine. With the 15,000 gallons captured at the American depot, Nishi's tank regiment surged forward into another assault, their vehicles finally mobile again after days of forced inactivity, pushing toward the next set of American positions with renewed hope that perhaps this captured fuel could make a difference, that perhaps this unexpected gift could change the tactical situation. They advanced approximately 2 miles before encountering prepared American defenses, a brief but intense firefight that consumed 3,000 gallons of their newfound supply in just 4 hours of combat. Type 97 Chiha tanks, with their inefficient engines and poor fuel economy, burned through gasoline at rates that made Nishi's logistics officer literally weep as he calculated consumption rates. Each tank consumed approximately 2 gallons per mile in combat conditions, and the terrible terrain of Iwo Jima volcanic ash, steep slopes, broken ground increased fuel consumption by nearly 50% beyond normal rates. By nightfall of March 8th, after 1 day of renewed operations, Nishi's forces had consumed nearly 5,000 of the 15,000 gallons they had captured, 1/3 of their miraculous discovery, burned in a single day's fighting that had achieved virtually nothing in terms of tactical gains. At this rate, the fuel that had seemed like salvation in the morning would be exhausted within 3 days, and they would be back to complete immobility, back to sitting in disabled vehicles, waiting for the Americans to destroy them at leisure. But the Americans, monitoring Japanese radio communications through their code-breaking operations, knew exactly what had happened, understood that the Japanese had captured the abandoned depot, and had already made calculations about the tactical implications. The orders that went out from Marine Command were brutally simple: deny all fuel to the enemy at any cost, destroy any supplies that might be captured, burn everything rather than risk Japanese acquisition. That evening, as Nishi's exhausted troops settled into defensive positions after their brief offensive, they could see in the distance a massive pillar of black smoke rising into the sky, so large and so intense that it was visible for miles across the island. American engineers had just destroyed another fuel depot, this one containing approximately 50,000 gallons, setting it ablaze rather than risk Japanese capture. The fire burned with such intensity that it could be felt as heat waves even from Nishi's position over a mile away, a bonfire of petroleum that consumed in one afternoon more fuel than the entire Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima had received in 2 months of fighting. Lieutenant Aoki, standing next to Nishi as they watched the distant conflagration, his voice barely a whisper, said what they were both thinking. They can afford to burn 50,000 gallons to keep it from us. What are we doing here? Across Iwo Jima and throughout the Pacific Theater, American forces were implementing the same policy: destroy fuel supplies rather than risk enemy capture, burn stockpiles rather than defend them, eliminate resources that might extend Japanese resistance even by a single day. On Saipan, during its final days, Americans had destroyed 200,000 gallons. On Guam, 300,000 gallons burned. On Tinian, 500,000 gallons were set ablaze rather than defended. In total, during the Pacific Campaign's final year, Americans deliberately destroyed over 3 million gallons of fuel, more than Japan had allocated for all military operations in the same period, treating millions of gallons with the casual indifference that the Japanese reserved for individual leaders. This ability to simply burn fuel rather than fight to protect it was rooted in a supply system that operated beyond Japanese comprehension, a logistical network that made such destruction not just possible but routine, barely worth mentioning in official reports because the amounts involved, while staggering to Japanese minds, were trivial within the context of American abundance. The American supply system in the Pacific was itself a greater industrial achievement than Japan's entire war production. Tanker convoys crossing from California to forward bases delivered more fuel monthly than all of Japan's domestic and captured production combined. The fleet train system, mobile floating supply depots that accompanied carrier task forces, could refuel an entire carrier group at sea, delivering hundreds of thousands of gallons while ships remained operational, a capability that Japan had never developed and could never replicate. Underwater pipelines had been laid between islands, aerial delivery systems used transport aircraft to drop fuel in drums to isolated units, and the logistical infrastructure supporting American forces consumed more fuel in its own operations than entire Japanese armies possessed. By March 1945, American forces in the Pacific were consuming approximately 1,200,000 gallons daily and receiving closer to 1,500,000 gallons daily, actually building reserves while fighting multiple simultaneous campaigns, treating fuel as unlimited rather than precious. The submarine service alone consumed more fuel than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. American aircraft burned more gasoline in training flights than Japanese aircraft used in combat operations, and the fuel used just to transport supplies exceeded Japan's total military allocation. Colonel James Patterson, the American logistics officer responsible for fuel distribution in the Iwo Jima sector, recorded in his daily report on March 9th a note that captured the fundamental disparity. Fuel receipts yesterday, 140,000 gallons. Fuel issued, 123,000 gallons. Net gain to reserve, 17,000 gallons. Note: weather delayed one scheduled tanker delivery. Will be made up tomorrow. The Americans were treating a 17,000-gallon reserve gain as a routine entry, while for Nishi that same amount represented more than his entire miraculous capture, more than enough to completely change his tactical situation, an amount that American logisticians barely noticed because it was simply normal operations, expected abundance, the routine functioning of a supply system that operated on a scale where such numbers were insignificant. As Nishi pushed deeper into defensive positions on March 9th, trying to preserve his remaining captured fuel while continuing to resist American advance, the mathematical impossibility of the Japanese position became crushingly clear. The brief offensive enabled by captured fuel had consumed 5,000 gallons and achieved nothing of lasting tactical value. His maintenance officer, Captain Saburo Hayashi, presented calculations that destroyed any remaining hope by current consumption rates. They had approximately 8,000 gallons remaining, enough for either one more major engagement or a fighting retreat to new positions, but not both, never both. Always forced to choose between tactical options because there was never enough fuel to do everything necessary, never enough resources to fight the way doctrine demanded, never enough supply to match tactical ambition. Meanwhile, the American forces surrounding Nishi's position, the 4th Marine Division, the 5th Marine Division, elements of the 3rd Marine Division, had a combined fuel allocation for March 9th alone of 280,000 gallons, more fuel available to American units in a single day than Nishi's entire regiment had received in 6 months. More petroleum supporting American operations in 24 hours than Japan had allocated to the entire Iwo Jima defense over weeks of fighting. Marine Corporal Robert Chun wrote in a letter home that captured the absurdity with devastating clarity. "We have Japs surrounded who ran out of gas for their tanks. Our captain jokes that we use more fuel keeping warm at night than they have for their whole operation. It's not even fair. It's not even war anymore. It's just math." This was perhaps the most accurate description of the Pacific War's final phase that any participant recorded. It was not war in any traditional sense, not a contest of bravery or tactical skill or fighting spirit, but simply mathematical calculation, industrial output translated into battlefield capability, the cold equations of production determining outcomes before the first shot was fired. The American response to any Japanese movement demonstrated industrial warfare at its apotheosis, war waged with such overwhelming resource advantage that tactical considerations became almost secondary to logistical capability. When Nishi's forces made their final defensive stand, American forces responded with artillery barrages that consumed more fuel in propellant charges than the Japanese had used in an entire day of operations, naval gunfire support from offshore battleships that burned fuel at rates measured in gallons per second, aerial bombardment by aircraft that each consumed more fuel per mission than a Japanese tank regiment possessed, a symphony of destruction powered by petroleum abundance that Japan could not match, could not even fully comprehend. On March 10th, clear weather allowed American air operations to reach full-intensity. Carrier aircraft flew 470 sorties, each aircraft consuming anywhere from 200 to 500 gallons per mission depending on type and duration. A single day's air operations burning more fuel, than the entire Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima had received since the battle began. F-6F Hellcats consumed 300 gallons per hour of flight time. SB-2C Helldiver bombers burned 450 gallons per hour. These aircraft operated continuously, flying multiple missions daily, pilots logging flight hours at rates that would have bankrupted the Japanese military if they had attempted to match such tempo. But American forces never slowed, because fuel was never a limiting factor, never something to conserve, never precious enough to ration. On the night of March 10th, with his fuel supplies nearly exhausted and his tactical position hopeless, Nishi made the decision that countless Japanese commanders had faced throughout the war's final years, whether to die in a final banzai charge or attempt to preserve his forces for continued resistance. The fuel situation made the decision for him. He had approximately 1,000 gallons remaining, enough to move his vehicles exactly once more, enough for either a mobile assault that would quickly exhaust all fuel or a repositioning to new defensive positions where they could fight as static pillboxes. Nishi chose the latter, moving his tanks under cover of darkness to prepared positions in Iwo Jima's northern highlands, where they would make their final stand not as mobile armor, but as fixed fortifications, their tracks dug into volcanic soil, their engines forever silenced by empty fuel tanks. Of the 17 tanks that had been refueled from the captured American depot, 14 made it to the new positions before running completely dry. 3 remained stranded along the route, abandoned not from battle damage but from fuel exhaustion, left sitting on the volcanic plain as monuments to resource depletion, as evidence of the simple mathematical truth that Japan could not fight this war. Sergeant Yoshio Matsumoto, responsible for fuel allocation in Nishi's regiment, described the final repositioning in testimony recorded years later. We drained every drop from every vehicle, combining fuel from damaged tanks into operational ones, measuring by the cup toward the end because we had no fuel left to waste. The colonel personally supervised, ordering us to leave behind any tank that would consume more fuel than we could spare. 3 tanks were abandoned with only minor damage because we had no fuel to move them. Millions of yen in equipment left sitting in the open because we lacked a few hundred liters of gasoline. This is what defeat looks like, not glorious last stands, but mathematics. The Americans, cataloging abandoned Japanese equipment the next day, found those 3 Type 97 tanks sitting exactly where they had been left, still mechanically functional, still armed, still fully capable of combat, rendered completely useless by nothing more than empty fuel tanks. Marine Lieutenant Thomas Harrison's salvage report noted with almost casual dismissal, 3 enemy tanks abandoned. Assessment: fuel exhaustion. Recovery: unnecessary. Status: target practice. What would have been a strategic disaster for Japanese forces, the loss of 3 combat vehicles, was so beneath American notice that they did not even bother recovering the tanks for intelligence purposes, simply using them as targets for gunnery practice because they represented no value, no threat, no significance whatsoever. News of Nishi's fuel discovery and its ultimate meaninglessness spread rapidly through Japanese command channels, transmitted in coded messages that American cryptanalysts intercepted and decoded, reading Japanese despair in real time as officers reported the brutal mathematics of their situation. On March 12th, Vice Admiral Achimaru Toshinasuke, commanding Japanese naval forces in the area, received a detailed report on the fuel situation. His chief of staff recorded Ichimaru's response in the unit diary. The admiral read the report on captured American fuel twice. 15,000 gallons captured. 50,000 gallons destroyed by Americans to deny us. 3 million gallons supporting American operations. He looked at me and said, "We are not fighting the same war. We are fighting the memory of a war that already ended." Even High Command in Tokyo, when informed of both the capture and the subsequent American fuel destructions, struggled to process the implications. General Koiso Kuniaki, prime minister and military leader, initially refused to accept the numbers as accurate, insisting they must represent propaganda or intelligence errors, claiming that no military force could casually destroy millions of gallons of fuel, that such reports must be American disinformation designed to destroy Japanese morale. But junior officers who had actually witnessed American operations, who had seen the casual abundance with their own eyes, knew better, and their letters home, despite military censorship, carried the crushing truth to the Japanese home front. Private Takeshi Yamada wrote to his wife in a letter that somehow passed censors, perhaps because the censor himself no longer saw the point in maintaining illusions. "The Americans leave more fuel behind when they retreat than we receive in a month. They burn millions of liters to keep it from us. They use gasoline to wash their vehicles, to heat water for bathing, to run generators for electric lights. We measure by the cup. They measure by the ocean. How can spirit overcome arithmetic? How can Bushido defeat a factory?" This knowledge, spreading through the ranks despite attempts to suppress it, did more damage to Japanese morale than any military defeat, any tactical setback, any strategic reverse could possibly achieve. Soldiers had been trained to accept death, to embrace sacrifice, to find meaning in struggle against overwhelming odds. But they had not been prepared for the revelation that those overwhelming odds were literally infinite, that the enemy possessed resources so vast that resistance was not merely difficult, but mathematically impossible, that every drop of fuel spent was a drop less than an opponent who would never run dry, who was actually increasing reserves while fighting, who treated millions as Americans treated pennies. The psychological impact of Nishi's discovery resonated beyond mere logistics, striking at the fundamental narratives that had sustained Japanese military doctrine, that had justified the war, that had promised victory through spiritual superiority over materialistic opponents. The entire ideology of Japanese militarism rested on the claim that spirit could overcome material deficiency, that Bushido would defeat industrial might, that the pure warrior soul of Japan would prevail over the decadent, comfort-seeking Americans who lacked fighting spirit. This narrative had survived early defeats, had weathered tactical setbacks, had persisted through strategic reverses because it existed in the realm of belief rather than evidence, of faith rather than calculation. But standing in a captured fuel depot surrounded by 15,000 gallons that meant everything to Japan and nothing to America, that narrative shattered against reality like waves against stone. How could American spirit be weak when they possessed wealth that allowed them to burn what Japan would die to possess? How could materialism be a weakness when it produced such overwhelming abundance that waste was meaningless? How could spiritual purity matter when the enemy operated on a scale that made purity irrelevant, that transformed virtue into insignificance? During the post-war period, when surviving Japanese commanders were interviewed about the war's turning points, they consistently cited fuel shortages rather than specific battles as the decisive factor, the constraint that shaped every decision and limited every option. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, former Combined Fleet Commander, testified that after 1943, every naval operation was constrained not by tactical considerations, but by fuel availability. That grand strategies were abandoned, not because they were flawed, but because there was no fuel to implement them. That the Imperial Navy had become a static coast defense force, not from choice, but from petroleum starvation. General Yamashita Tamayuki, defender of the Philippines, described how fuel shortages paralyzed his forces, prevented reinforcement movements, immobilized armor, grounded aircraft, and ultimately doomed entire army groups not to defeat in battle, but to immobility and piecemeal destruction. And Colonel Nishi, in his final radio transmission before Iwo Jima fell completely, sent a message that captured the essential truth of Japan's situation. Every tactical decision since March 8 has been determined by fuel shortage. We cannot maneuver, cannot pursue, cannot retreat effectively. The Americans move freely while we count leaders. This is not a war. This is an execution. The story of Nishi's discovery resonates decades later because it represents the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion, when the romantic notion of war as a contest of valor finally died in the face of production statistics, when it became undeniably clear that modern conflicts between industrial powers would be decided in factories and refineries rather than on battlefields, determined by production capacity rather than tactical brilliance, won by the side that could supply abundance rather than the side that fought with spirit. The Japanese soldier of 1945 was arguably better trained than his American counterpart, more experienced in infantry tactics, more committed to victory, more willing to fight to the death. None of it mattered. The Americans were backed by an industrial machine that could waste more resources than Japan could produce, that treated abundance as routine rather than precious, that operated on a scale where Japanese scarcity became completely irrelevant to American planning. This brutal truth was encoded in every fuel drum at that captured depot, in every gallon burned by American engineers, in every pipeline across the Pacific, in every tanker convoy, in every routine delivery that exceeded Japanese strategic reserves. By March 1945, the United States was producing approximately 67% of the world's petroleum, an amount so vast that it defied comprehension for nations operating under scarcity. Japan's total production, including all captured territories, represented less than 1/5 of 1% of American output, a disparity so enormous that no amount of tactical skill could overcome it, no fighting spirit could bridge it, no strategic genius could compensate for it. The war had been decided by these numbers long before Pearl Harbor. The outcome predetermined by production statistics that were publicly available, the result inevitable once American industrial capacity fully mobilized for war production. Japan had gambled on a short war, on striking before America could mobilize, on achieving victory before resources ran out. But the gamble was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of American capability, on the belief that Americans lacked the will to fight rather than the recognition that they possessed resources so vast that will was irrelevant because victory was mathematically certain. The final irony came when American forces, cataloging abandoned Japanese equipment after Iwo Jima's fall, discovered Nishi's 14 tanks dug into defensive positions, each one mechanically functional, each one still armed and dangerous, each one rendered completely useless by nothing more than empty fuel tanks. Major William Bradford's equipment assessment report noted with clinical precision Japanese armor positions evaluated. All tanks operational except for fuel depletion. Fuel requirement for recovery, approximately 4,000 gallons. Assessment, not worth the effort. American fuel reserves on island, 240,000 gallons. Recovery classified as unnecessary given abundance of supply. 4,000 gallons to potentially save and study 14 enemy tanks was calculated as not worth the effort by American forces that had nearly 250,000 gallons in reserve, while for Japanese forces those same 4,000 gallons would have represented a strategic treasure, enough to continue resistance for days, enough to matter tactically. This was Nishi's discovery distilled to its essence, not merely that America had more fuel, but that American abundance operated on a scale that made Japanese scarcity literally beneath notice, that American waste exceeded Japanese need, that the mathematics were so lopsided that the war had never been a contest, but only an execution postponed by Japanese courage and American logistics. On March 26, 1945, after 3 weeks of continued resistance in positions, sustainable only because his tanks no longer needed fuel to function as static pillboxes, Colonel Takeichi Nishi was killed in the final American assault on the northern highlands of Iwo Jima. His body was never recovered, lost somewhere in the volcanic caves and tunnels that had become a tomb for thousands of Japanese soldiers. But before his death, Nishi had written a final entry in his journal, found decades later among captured documents and translated for historical record. We discovered 15,000 gallons and believed briefly in miracles. We learned the Americans had burned 50,000 gallons like garbage. We understood finally that we had lost this war before it began, that we were fighting against mathematical certainty rather than an enemy army, that courage cannot overcome arithmetic. If I had understood this in 1941, if I had made clear to our leaders what I learned in America about their industrial. The collapse of Japan's strategic illusion did not occur in a single moment, nor was it acknowledged openly by those who had built it. Like a structure eaten away from within, it weakened silently, its foundations hollowed out by facts that could no longer be denied, but were still not spoken aloud. By the spring of 1945, every senior Japanese commander understood, at least privately, that defeat was inevitable. What remained unresolved was not whether Japan would lose, but how long the nation would continue to sacrifice lives to preserve the appearance of resistance in a war already decided by arithmetic. Fuel scarcity was the lens through which this realization became unavoidable. Unlike morale or ideology, fuel could not be argued with. It could not be replaced by courage. It could not be substituted with loyalty. An empty tank was an absolute condition, an unambiguous end to action. When fuel ran out, so did choice. And by 1945, Japan had run out everywhere. The final year of the war transformed the Imperial Japanese military into an institution trapped by its own mythology. Commanders continued to issue orders based on doctrines that assumed mobility, reinforcement, and sustained operations capabilities that no longer existed. Field officers were forced to reinterpret these orders creatively, often stripping them of their original intent simply to make them executable under conditions of total scarcity. A planned counteroffensive became a static defense. A maneuver became a gesture. A campaign became a holding action with no prospect of relief. In this environment, fuel ceased to be a logistical concern and became the primary strategic determinant. Entire operations were canceled, not because the enemy was too strong, but because the journey itself could not be fueled. Reinforcements sat idle within reach of threatened sectors, unable to move. Aircraft remained grounded during critical moments, because aviation gasoline had been reserved for kamikaze sorties deemed more efficient in their one-way consumption. Naval units stayed at anchor as battles raged elsewhere, powerless not from damage but from emptiness. The psychological toll of this paralysis was profound. Japanese soldiers had been taught that death was honorable, that sacrifice was noble, that surrender was unthinkable. But immobility offered no such narrative comfort. Sitting in a tank that could not move, guarding a position that could not be reinforced, waiting for an enemy who advanced inexorably behind an endless curtain of artillery and aircraft, stripped combat of its meaning. There was no charge, no clash of wills, no decisive moment, only waiting, rationing, and eventual annihilation. Fuel starvation did not just limit action. It eroded purpose. American commanders, observing this deterioration, adjusted their operational philosophy accordingly. They no longer sought decisive engagements in the traditional sense. They applied pressure methodically, knowing that Japanese resistance was a wasting asset. Time, not daring, became the decisive factor. Each day, the Americans advanced their logistics forward, built new depots, extended pipelines, and accumulated reserves. Each day, the Japanese burned through irreplaceable resources. The asymmetry widened relentlessly. This shift in warfare from contest to inevitability had consequences beyond the battlefield. It reshaped how the war was remembered, justified, and eventually explained to the Japanese population. Even as cities burned under bombing raids and infrastructure collapsed, official narratives continued to emphasize spirit and endurance, avoiding the unpalatable truth that Japan had been economically outmatched from the outset. To admit otherwise would have meant acknowledging that millions had died not for victory, but for the preservation of an illusion. After the war, this reluctance persisted. Early post-war memoirs by Japanese leaders often framed defeat as the result of overwhelming American technology or atomic weapons, minimizing the role of long-term industrial imbalance. The emphasis on singular events, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, obscured the continuous process of attrition driven by resource disparity. But as archives opened and documents were analyzed, a different picture emerged, one that aligned precisely with what Nishi had understood in that fuel depot. The decisive factor was not innovation, nor morale, nor even battlefield skill. It was capacity. The United States did not merely outproduce Japan. It outproduced the concept of scarcity itself. American planners operated in a strategic environment where constraints were temporary and solvable, where shortages prompted expansion rather than retreat. Japanese planners operated in an environment where constraints were permanent and cumulative, where every solution worsened another problem. This difference shaped every interaction between the two militaries. When Americans lost ships, they built more. When they lost aircraft, factories replaced them faster than pilots could be trained. When fuel consumption increased, production increased faster still. Losses were absorbed, neutralized, rendered temporary. For Japan, losses compounded. Each tanker sunk reduced future operations. Each refinery bombed narrowed options further. Each liter burned brought the end closer. The Pacific War thus became a study in asymmetrical endurance. Japan's strategy relied on inflicting enough pain early to force negotiation before resources ran out. America's strategy, once mobilized, required only persistence. This asymmetry meant that time favored one side absolutely. There was no equilibrium point, no scenario in which continued fighting improved Japan's position. Every additional month of war reduced Japanese capacity while American capacity expanded. The refusal to confront this reality earlier was not merely an error of judgment. It was a failure of intellectual courage. Japanese leadership chose to believe in myths rather than mathematics, in narratives rather than numbers. They dismissed production tables as abstractions, underestimated logistics as secondary concerns, and elevated ideology above evidence. The result was a war fought not to win, but to postpone recognition of defeat. Colonel Nishi's tragedy lies in his clarity arriving too late. He had seen America before the war, understood its nature, and yet had participated in a system that suppressed that understanding. When he finally articulated the truth, it could no longer alter outcomes, only illuminate them. His realization did not save his regiment, his island, or his nation. It served instead as a record, a final honest assessment from within a collapsing structure. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, fuel shortages had reached absolute zero across most theaters. Aircraft sat abandoned on airfields, ships rusted at anchor. Vehicles lined roadsides, empty and silent. The imperial military, once envisioned as a modern mechanized force, had been reduced to infantry formations fighting without mobility, without supply, without hope of reinforcement. The war ended not with a final maneuver, but with exhaustion. And yet, the most striking aspect of this collapse is how predictable it had been. The numbers had always pointed in this direction. The outcome had been visible long before the first landing craft reached Iwo Jima. What changed in 1945 was not the balance of power, but the willingness to acknowledge it. In the years immediately following Japan's surrender, the nation entered a period of collective silence. Cities lay in ruins, industries shattered, infrastructure collapsed, and millions struggled simply to survive. In this environment, reflection came slowly. Survival preceded interpretation. Hunger replaced ideology. Reconstruction displaced memory. And yet, beneath the surface of rebuilding, a quieter reckoning began to take shape, one that would eventually redefine how the war was understood, not only in Japan, but across the modern world. For Japanese military analysts who survived, fuel scarcity emerged again and again as the unspoken center of every failure. When stripped of rhetoric, reports revealed the same pattern across all theaters. Operations planned without regard to supply sustainability, offensives launched without fuel to exploit success, defenses established without the ability to maneuver or withdraw. The Imperial Japanese military had entered a mechanized war without the material foundation required to sustain mechanization. This was not a flaw discovered in defeat. It was embedded from the beginning. Post-war interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence exposed how deeply leadership had misjudged the nature of modern conflict. Senior officers admitted they had assumed America would negotiate once casualties mounted, failing to grasp that American society, supported by industrial abundance, could absorb losses without strategic collapse. The assumption that public morale would break before production did proved catastrophically wrong. Factories mattered more than headlines. Refineries mattered more than speeches. American analysts, reviewing captured documents, were struck not by Japanese tactical incompetence, but by strategic denial. Japan's officers were intelligent, disciplined, and often innovative within constraints. What they lacked was the freedom to operate outside a system that refused to acknowledge its own limitations. Fuel shortages were discussed privately, but rarely allowed to dictate grand strategy openly. The result was a war plan detached from physical reality. The United States, by contrast, treated logistics as doctrine. Fuel planning preceded maneuver planning. Supply capacity defined operational reach. The ability to deliver petroleum determined where and when force could be applied. This was not accidental. It reflected a broader American approach to war as an extension of industrial management. War was not an interruption of economic life. It was a reconfiguration of it. Victory depended not on singular brilliance, but on system performance. This difference explains why American commanders could afford patience. They did not need to gamble on decisive blows. They did not need to accept disproportionate risk. They could apply pressure incrementally, confident that time worked exclusively in their favor. Japanese commanders, facing shrinking options, were forced into increasingly desperate measures, not because of inferior skill, but because scarcity compressed decision-making until no alternatives remained. The myth of spiritual superiority collapsed under this weight. Post-war Japanese scholarship gradually dismantled the notion that morale could substitute for resources. Military academies rewrote curricula. Logistics, once treated as a supporting function, became central to strategic education. The war's final lesson was institutionalized. Modern conflict is not decided by bravery alone, nor even by battlefield skill, but by the capacity to sustain force over time. Colonel Nishi's experience on Iwo Jima came to symbolize this realization. His discovery was not remarkable because it revealed American strength. It was remarkable because it exposed Japanese vulnerability with undeniable clarity. 15,000 gallons meant salvation to one side and nothing to the other. That disparity encapsulated the entire war. It explained why resistance continued long after victory was impossible. It explained why sacrifice escalated as prospects diminished. And it explained why defeat, when it came, felt less like a loss in battle and more like awakening from a long-delayed illusion. In the decades that followed, historians would revisit the Pacific War with greater analytical distance. Production figures replaced heroic narratives. Shipping tonnage replaced battlefield anecdotes. Fuel consumption charts told stories more decisive than medals or citations. The war emerged not as a clash of civilizations, but as a demonstration of what happens when industrial capacity and strategic planning align on one side and diverge on the other. This reframing altered how future wars were planned worldwide. No major power would again enter a mechanized conflict without securing fuel supply as a primary strategic concern. No serious military planner would ignore logistics in favor of ideology. The lesson was too costly, too clear. Industrial war had rules, and Japan had violated the most fundamental one. Never fight a resource war you cannot sustain. The true legacy of Iwo Jima, then, lies not only in its battlefield heroism, but in its silent arithmetic. Every shell fired, every aircraft launched, every tank advanced was a function of fuel availability. Where fuel flowed freely, operations continued. Where it dried up, resistance hardened briefly and then collapsed. Courage determined how long men would fight. Fuel determined how long they could. As Japan rebuilt in the post-war era, it did so with a new understanding of power. Economic strength replaced martial spirit as the foundation of national security. Trade routes replaced conquest. Energy policy became a matter of survival rather than convenience. The nation that had once measured fuel by the cup now measured prosperity by efficiency, integration, and sustainability. The transformation was not merely economic. It was philosophical. Nishi did not live to see this transformation. His death on Iwo Jima closed his story at the moment of understanding, not resolution, but his insight endured. It survived not because it was recorded in official doctrine, but because it matched reality too precisely to be forgotten. It explained defeat without insult and victory without glorification. It replaced myth with measurement. By the time the last shots faded on Iwo Jima, nothing truly ended. What concluded on that island was not merely a battle, nor even a campaign, but an illusion that had sustained an entire war. The ground did not mark defeat, exhaustion did. The silence that followed was not the silence of surrender, but the stillness of systems that had run dry. Colonel Takeichi Nishi's final understanding did not die with him. It lingered, unspoken but undeniable, embedded in the wreckage of tanks that could not move, aircraft that could not fly, ships that could not sail. These were not symbols of bravery defeated by force. They were artifacts of a war constrained by arithmetic. Each empty fuel tank was a sentence written in numbers rather than blood, explaining what ideology never could. The Pacific War is often remembered through images of ferocity, sacrifice, and endurance. But beneath those images lies a quieter truth, one less dramatic and far more decisive. The outcome was sealed not on beaches or in jungles, but in refineries, shipping yards, and balance sheets. Long before Marines landed on Iwo Jima, long before pilots flew their final missions, the war's conclusion existed in production tables and fuel ledgers. It was visible to anyone willing to look. Japan entered the conflict believing that will could overcome capacity, that moral purity could compensate for material deficit. This belief shaped strategy, justified risk, and excused sacrifice. It also blinded leadership to the nature of the enemy. America was not merely a nation with greater resources. It was a system designed to convert resources into sustained power. Once mobilized, that system could not be meaningfully opposed by a nation operating under permanent scarcity. This was the fatal asymmetry. Japan fought every engagement as if it were decisive because it could not afford endurance. America fought as if no single engagement mattered because it could afford all of them. One side spent itself forward. The other accumulated strength even while advancing. No battlefield brilliance could reverse that equation. The burning fuel depots, the abandoned Japanese armor, the immobilized fleets, these were not accidents of war. They were the natural consequences of a mismatch between ambition and capacity. The Americans destroyed fuel because fuel was infinite to them. The Japanese conserved fuel because every drop represented survival. That contrast alone explains the war's trajectory more clearly than any tactical map. When historians ask when Japan lost the war, the honest answer is uncomfortable: before it began. Not because defeat was inevitable in some abstract sense, but because the strategic assumptions underpinning the decision to fight were fundamentally flawed. The belief that America could be shocked into retreat ignored the reality that America could simply outproduce shock itself. The belief that sacrifice could substitute for supply ignored the physical limits of machines and men alike. Nishi's tragedy is that he understood this truth fully only at the moment when understanding could no longer change outcomes. His discovery on Iwo Jima did not reveal American strength. It revealed Japanese miscalculation. It showed that courage, while real and profound, operates within boundaries set by resources. It showed that valor without sustainability becomes ritual rather than strategy. It showed that modern war punishes illusion without mercy. The war's end forced Japan to confront these realities. In defeat, the nation did what it had not done in victory. It adapted. It rebuilt not around conquest, but around production. It replaced ideology with infrastructure, expansion with efficiency, and myth with measurement. The lessons learned in devastation reshaped Japan into a different kind of power, one grounded not in martial fantasy, but in economic reality. Today, the rusting remains of war machines still surface from Pacific sands and seas. They tell no heroic story on their own. They speak, instead of limits, of engines that required fuel, of systems that demanded supply, of wars that obeyed rules regardless of belief. They stand as quiet reminders that modern conflict is governed less by passion than by provision. In the end, Iwo Jima did not teach the world that Japan fought bravely or that America fought ruthlessly. Those truths were already known. What it taught, through silence, through abandonment, through arithmetic, was that wars between industrial powers are decided long before the first soldier advances. They are decided when one side can afford to waste what the other cannot obtain. Colonel Nishi understood this standing among American fuel drums, watching his men celebrate a miracle that was, in truth, a revelation of doom. He saw clearly what an entire nation had refused to accept, that courage cannot overcome arithmetic, that spirit cannot replace supply, and that no army can outfight an opponent whose resources render resistance finite. The war ended as it had been fought, not with a final maneuver, but with depletion. And in that depletion lay the final verdict. The Pacific War was never a contest of wills. It was a contest of capacity. And that contest had been decided long before the sands of Iwo Jima ever turned black beneath marching boots.